Captain Jack Sterling had been on countless missions throughout his career as a pilot, but none like this. He had just set off on a routine exploration mission to a distant planet, far away from Earth. The stars glittered like diamonds, and everything seemed peaceful. But peace was fleeting in the vastness of space. Something went wrong. The control panel in front of Jack flickered with warning lights, and a high-pitched whine filled his ears. He quickly glanced over at the sensors. The spaceship was losing power at an alarming rate. The ship's engine sputtered and groaned, sending a chill of fear down Jack's spine. He had been trained for emergencies, but nothing could prepare him for this moment. His hands tightened on the controls, but the ship was beyond saving. The ship veered off course, and Jack gritted his teeth. He could feel the force of gravity pulling them down, spiraling toward the unknown planet below. The air was thick with tension. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to steer the ship, but it was no use. The planet was coming up fast. Before he knew it, the ship crashed hard against the ground with a loud, earth-shattering thud. The sound of metal crumpling, glass shattering, and alarms blaring filled the air. Jack's world spun wildly as the ship rolled and came to a screeching halt. For a few moments, everything was still. Then, the smoke began to pour from the wreckage, and Jack gasped for air. He was shaken, his body bruised from the violent crash. But somehow, he was still alive. He quickly unbuckled his seatbelt, groaning as he stood up, his head spinning. His eyes scanned the area. The cockpit was a mess of twisted metal and shattered glass, but the rest of the ship seemed mostly intact. "Focus, Jack," he muttered to himself. He wasn't going to let this be the end. He grabbed his emergency pack and made his way out of the cockpit. The ship's door was jammed, but with a little effort, Jack pried it open. He stepped into the unknown world outside. The air was different, thick, humid, and strangely sweet. Jack took a deep breath, coughing slightly as his lungs adjusted to the unfamiliar atmosphere. He squinted into the horizon, trying to make sense of the alien landscape before him. Massive trees towered over the land, their leaves shimmering in strange colors he had never seen before. The ground was covered in dense vegetation, and strange sounds filled the air. It was a far cry from the familiar environments of Earth. Jack took a cautious step forward, feeling a slight unease at the unfamiliarity of it all. The planet was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. He knew it wouldn't be long before he had to find shelter and assess the damage to the ship. The wreckage was in the middle of a thick forest, and he wasn't sure how far away from civilization, if there was any, he had ended up. His first priority was survival. He had been trained for situations like this, but being stranded alone on an alien planet was something no amount of training could prepare him for. Jack pulled out a small device from his pack, hoping to signal for help. But after trying for several minutes, he saw the screen blink and show a low signal, barely enough to send a distress message. Frustration began to creep in, but Jack pushed it down. Panicking wouldn't help him. His only choice was to remain calm and assess the situation. "First, find shelter," he said aloud, trying to steady his thoughts. He looked around for a safe place to take refuge for the night. That's when he noticed something strange. Movement in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a wild animal, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't an animal at all. A group of beings, not human but humanoid, were gathered in a clearing. They appeared to be young, and there was something odd about their presence. They were unlike any alien species Jack had ever studied. Their skin was a pale blue, and their eyes were large and expressive, filled with curiosity. But what struck Jack the most was their appearance. They looked innocent, untrained, and almost vulnerable. They didn't notice him immediately. Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He had never expected to encounter any form of intelligent life on this planet, let alone find beings that seemed so unprepared for the wilds of their own world. Jack took a few careful steps forward, making sure not to make any sudden movements. The girls turned their heads in his direction, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. Jack's first instinct was to protect them, but he had no idea who or what they were. Were they friendly, or did they pose a threat? "Hey," Jack called out cautiously, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. The words felt strange on his tongue, as he wasn't sure they would understand him. Still, he hoped some form of communication might work. The girls stared at him in silence, eyes still wide. Then one of them, dressed in simple clothes, clearly unfamiliar with advanced technology, took a small step forward. Her face showed a mix of awe and fear. Jack tried again. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. The girls looked at each other, uncertain of how to react. Jack had no idea what was going on, or what these alien girls had been through, but one thing was certain: he was no longer alone. Captain Jack Sterling stood in the dense forest, the sound of the strange planet's wildlife echoing around him. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The young alien girls, standing in front of him, had not yet moved. They stared at him with wide eyes, a mix of curiosity and wariness written on their faces. Jack took a cautious step forward, trying to appear non-threatening. He needed to understand who they were and why they were here. "I come in peace," he said softly, although he wasn't sure they could understand his language. His words felt strange in his mouth, as he had never imagined finding intelligent life on a planet like this. One of the girls, the tallest among them, took a hesitant step forward. Her eyes locked with Jack's, and he could see the uncertainty in her gaze. Her pale blue skin shimmered slightly in the dim light filtering through the dense trees. She was tall but still looked young, her features soft and almost fragile. Jack wasn't sure what their age or development level was, but it seemed clear that these beings were unlike anything he had encountered before. The other girls stayed behind her, watching with wide eyes. They were clearly more afraid, staying close together for comfort. Jack could sense that they didn't know what to make of him. He was a stranger in their world. The situation was delicate, and Jack knew that one wrong move could make things worse. "Are you alone?" Jack asked, hoping to gather more information. He didn't want to scare them, but he had to know what kind of situation he was walking into. The girl in front of him blinked, and Jack thought for a moment that she might not answer. But then she nodded slightly, still holding his gaze. Jack's heart sank as he realized they were alone. No adults or other beings were around. The thought of these young alien girls surviving alone in such an unfamiliar and dangerous world sent a chill down his spine. The tall girl reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently touching Jack's sleeve. Her fingers were delicate, and the contact felt strangely reassuring. Jack stiffened slightly but didn't pull away. He had no idea what this gesture meant, but he decided to remain calm and wait for her to speak or show him more. After a long pause, the girl spoke in a language Jack couldn't understand. Her voice was soft, melodic, and almost musical. It didn't sound threatening at all, but Jack could sense that they were trying to communicate. The words were unfamiliar, but Jack's translator device on his wrist beeped faintly, struggling to keep up. He tried his best to understand, using his knowledge of language patterns from various alien species. "I don't understand," Jack said gently, his voice low and steady. He reached into his pack and pulled out his universal translator, hoping it would help bridge the communication gap. The girl watched him curiously as Jack fiddled with the device, adjusting the settings. After a few moments, the device beeped, and the translator finally began to work. Jack could hear her voice clearly now, though it still sounded soft and melodic, like a gentle wind blowing through trees. "Who are you?" The girl's voice echoed in Jack's ear through the translator, her words slow and careful. Jack exhaled in relief. He could understand her now. "I'm Jack. A human," he replied, keeping his tone friendly. "I'm from a distant planet, Earth. I'm stranded here after my ship crashed." The girl tilted her head, clearly intrigued. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning him with curiosity. "You're from the stars?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Jack nodded. Yes, from far away. I've never been to a place like this before. What's this planet called? The girl paused, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She glanced at the others, who seemed equally puzzled. They exchanged looks, and Jack realized that they didn't have a word for their own planet, or perhaps they had no concept of naming it. We don't know, she replied softly. It is just home. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for them. These girls seemed so innocent, lost in a world that was foreign to them. They were alone, with no one to guide or protect them. It was a harsh reality for such young beings, and Jack felt a deep sense of responsibility to help them. Where are the others? Jack asked gently, hoping to get more information. Are there more of you? The girl shook her head, her expression growing more somber. Only us. For a long time. We are alone here. Jack's heart sank as he realized the full weight of their situation. These girls had no one but each other to rely on. And now, they had him. A stranger who was stranded on their planet. Jack wasn't sure what his next move should be, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave them here, alone and vulnerable. We need to find shelter, Jack said, looking around at the thick forest. It's not safe to stay out here. The tall girl nodded. Without another word, she turned and beckoned Jack to follow her. The other girls hesitated for a moment, but then followed, stepping carefully through the dense underbrush. Jack had no choice but to follow them. They seemed to know this planet better than he did, and their presence gave him some comfort in this strange and dangerous place. As they moved deeper into the forest, Jack couldn't help but wonder about the story behind these young girls. What had happened to the rest of their people? Why were they alone on such a dangerous planet? Jack knew he needed to learn more, but for now, he had to focus on survival, both for himself and the girls who had somehow become his responsibility. Jack followed the group of girls deeper into the forest, his eyes constantly scanning the unfamiliar landscape. The trees towered above them, their leaves shimmering in colors that were unlike anything he had ever seen before. The air was thick with a strange, sweet scent that made Jack's head spin slightly. The planet felt alive, almost as if the very ground beneath him was pulsing with energy. The girls moved quickly, their steps light and sure despite their apparent youth. They seemed to know this forest well, as if it was a place they had always called home. Jack couldn't help but admire their confidence, even in such an unfamiliar situation. It was clear that they were survivors, having adapted to the wild environment around them. Despite their innocence, they seemed to have an understanding of how to navigate this strange world. As they walked, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The deeper they went into the forest, the more the air seemed to shift, growing heavier and more oppressive. Strange sounds echoed from the shadows, alien creatures, no doubt. Jack instinctively reached for his survival gear, making sure everything was in place, just in case they needed to defend themselves. The last thing he wanted was to get caught off guard in a world that was so different from anything he had ever known. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift shelter, a small crude structure made of branches, leaves, and vines. It wasn't much, but it looked like it had been built with care. Jack observed the shelter closely, noting that it seemed sturdy enough to provide some protection from the elements. The tall girl, who had been leading the group, stepped forward and motioned for Jack to follow her inside. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But he knew it was better to stay close to the girls, at least for now. He wasn't sure how long they had been living on this planet, but they had clearly managed to survive on their own, and Jack needed to learn more if he was going to help them. Inside the shelter, the air was cooler, and the smell of earth and wood filled Jack's nostrils. The walls of the shelter were covered in thick vines, and there was a small fire pit in the center. It was nothing fancy, but it looked like a safe place to rest. The girls immediately began to arrange themselves around the fire. They sat on the ground, their faces still full of curiosity as they watched Jack with wide eyes. He felt like an outsider in this strange world, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that these girls had been waiting for someone like him. Jack sat down across from them, trying to relax despite the overwhelming sense of isolation. He was stranded on an alien planet with no way to contact Earth, no way to call for help. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward these girls. They were alone, just like him, but they had somehow managed to survive in a world that was full of unknown dangers. "Do you have a name?" Jack asked the tall girl, trying to keep the conversation going. He needed to know more about them, about their past, and how they ended up on this planet. The girl looked at him for a moment, as if considering his question. She then nodded and spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I am Lyra." Jack smiled, relieved to finally know her name. "It's nice to meet you, Lyra." Lyra glanced at the other girls, who were still sitting quietly around the fire. She spoke again, her voice almost like a whisper. They don't speak much. They're scared." Jack nodded in understanding. "I can imagine. This must be a difficult time for all of you." Lyra's gaze dropped to the ground. "It's been lonely," she said softly. "We've been alone for a long time. We don't know how we ended up here, or why we are the only ones. The others, they left, and we never saw them again." Jack's heart ached at the sadness in her voice. He could sense that there was much more to their story, but Lyra wasn't ready to share it all just yet. He could only imagine the pain they had endured. "We'll figure it out," Jack said, trying to offer reassurance. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here to help." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She seemed to want to believe him, but there was a certain hesitation in her gaze. Jack knew that trust had to be earned, and he was willing to do whatever it took to prove he was someone they could rely on. For the next few hours, Jack and the girls stayed in the shelter, the fire crackling softly in the background. Jack shared stories of Earth, stories of humans, cities, and technology. The girls listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide as they tried to imagine a world so different from their own. As the night wore on, Jack found himself growing more and more attached to these young girls. They had no one else to turn to, and Jack was determined to be their protector, their guide through this strange world. But as he sat there, listening to the crackling fire and watching the girls slowly drift off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival on this planet wasn't an accident. Something had brought them here, and something more was at play. The night sky outside the shelter was clear, and Jack gazed up at the stars, wondering if anyone on Earth was looking back at him. How long would it take for someone to find him? How long would he be stuck on this alien world? But as the girls slept peacefully around him, Jack made a silent promise to them. He would figure out how to survive here, and he would help them uncover the mystery of their past. No matter what it took, Jack would make sure they were safe. The morning came with a strange glow, as two suns peeked through the thick canopy. Jack woke up to the faint sound of chirping, but unlike the birds he knew, these creatures' calls had a metallic ring to them. The alien world continued to surprise him. He rubbed his eyes and glanced around the small shelter. Lyra and the other girls were already awake, quietly preparing for the day ahead. "Good morning," Jack said, sitting up and stretching. His body was sore from sleeping on the hard ground, but he was grateful to be alive. Lyra offered a small nod in return. She seemed more relaxed around Jack now, though the other girls still kept their distance, watching him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "We need food," Lyra said, her voice soft but firm. Jack nodded. "All right, let's see what we can find." Lyra led the way, and the group ventured deeper into the forest. Jack marveled at the alien flora around him. Massive mushrooms that glowed faintly, plants with translucent leaves, and vines that seemed to hum as they moved. It was beautiful, but Jack knew better than to trust appearances. "Are there predators here?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra glanced back, her expression serious. Yes, many. We must stay together. Jack tightened his grip on his makeshift spear, a sturdy branch he had sharpened with his survival knife. He wasn't sure how effective it would be, but it was better than nothing. They stopped near a cluster of strange fruit hanging from a low tree. The fruit was bright orange and shaped like a teardrop, with a faint glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lyra gestured toward it. "These are safe," she said, plucking one and handing it to Jack. Jack examined the fruit, then took a cautious bite. It was sweet and juicy, with a texture similar to a peach. He smiled. Not bad. The other girls gathered around and began picking the fruit, filling small woven baskets they had carried from the shelter. Jack kept watch, scanning the forest for any signs of danger. As they worked, a faint rustling sound reached Jack's ears. He froze, holding up a hand to signal the others to stop. The rustling grew louder, and Jack's heart raced. Something was moving in the underbrush, and it was getting closer. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered, positioning himself between the girls and the approaching sound. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, without warning, a creature burst from the bushes. It was small, about the size of a dog, with 6 legs and a sleek, scaly body. Its eyes glowed an eerie green, and its sharp teeth were bared in a snarl. Jack's instincts kicked in. He held his spear ready, stepping forward to confront the creature. It circled him, growling low, its movements quick and fluid. Jack knew he had to act fast. The creature lunged, and Jack thrust his spear forward, aiming for its side. The spear struck true, and the creature let out a high-pitched screech before collapsing to the ground. Jack's hands trembled as he pulled the spear back, his breath coming in quick gasps. Lyra and the girls stared at him in awe. You killed it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, trying to steady his breathing. "Are there more of these?" Lyra shook her head. "This one was alone. But others will come if they smell blood." Jack glanced down at the creature. Its sleek body was covered in dark scales, and its sharp claws glinted in the light. It looked like a predator, designed for speed and precision. Jack knew they couldn't stay here much longer. "Let's go," he said, motioning for the group to move. "We need to get back to the shelter." The girls quickly gathered the remaining fruit, and they began their journey back. Jack stayed alert, his eyes scanning the forest for any signs of movement. The encounter with the creature had shaken him, but it had also given him a better understanding of the dangers they faced. When they finally reached the shelter, Jack felt a sense of relief. The girls hurried inside, and Jack followed, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. "We can't stay here forever," Jack said, breaking the silence. "This place is too dangerous. We need a plan." Lyra looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "What kind of plan?" Jack sat down, his spear resting beside him. "We need to find higher ground, somewhere safer. And we need to figure out how to signal for help." Lyra nodded slowly. "There is a mountain," she said, "far from here. We've never been there, but it looks strong." Jack's mind raced. A mountain could provide better shelter and a vantage point for signaling passing ships. It was risky, but it might be their best chance. "All right," Jack said. "We'll prepare, gather supplies and rest. Tomorrow, we head for the mountain." The girls exchanged nervous glances, but Lyra nodded in agreement. Jack could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw a spark of hope. They were scared, but they weren't giving up. As night fell, Jack sat by the fire, his thoughts filled with uncertainty. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but he was determined to protect these girls and find a way back home. The next morning, Jack woke to the soft hum of the alien forest. The light filtering through the trees had an amber glow, and the air felt cooler. Today was the day they would leave their shelter and head for the distant mountain. Jack wasn't sure how far it was, but he knew staying in one place wasn't an option anymore. Lyra and the other girls were busy packing the few supplies they had, woven baskets of fruit, a small container of water gathered from the nearby stream, and some blankets made from large leaves. Jack took a moment to sharpen his spear and double-check the condition of his survival knife. He had no idea what dangers lay ahead, but he wasn't going to take any chances. "We're ready," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the nervous glances exchanged among the group. Jack nodded. "Stay close to me. We'll move fast but quiet. If you see anything suspicious, let me know immediately." With that, they set off. The forest was dense, its towering trees and thick undergrowth creating an almost labyrinthine path. Jack led the way, his spear at the ready and his senses on high alert. Lyra followed closely, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings, while the other girls moved cautiously behind her. The first few hours passed without incident, but the terrain grew steeper as they approached the base of the mountain. The vibrant colors of the forest gradually gave way to a more rugged landscape, with rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. Jack noticed how quiet it had become. The strange, metallic chirps of the forest creatures were replaced by an eerie silence. "This feels too quiet," Jack muttered, his grip tightening on the spear. Lyra nodded, her expression tense. "Something is watching us." Jack stopped, motioning for the group to stay still. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he caught a flicker of movement in the shadows. His heart pounded as he slowly raised his spear, ready for whatever was lurking nearby. A low growl echoed through the air, and suddenly, a massive creature emerged from behind a boulder. It was unlike anything Jack had ever seen, towering and muscular, with thick, dark fur and glowing red eyes. Its clawed hands scraped against the rocky ground as it advanced toward them. "Run," Jack shouted, stepping forward to block the creature's path. The girls hesitated for a moment before obeying, scrambling up the rocky incline toward the mountain. Jack held his ground, his spear pointed at the creature. It lunged at him, its claws swiping dangerously close, but Jack managed to sidestep just in time. He jabbed the spear forward, aiming for its exposed side, but the creature's thick fur deflected the blow. "Damn it," Jack muttered, retreating a few steps as the creature roared in anger. Lyra appeared at the top of the incline, her eyes wide with fear. "Jack, come on," she shouted. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted up the slope, his muscles burning as he climbed. The creature let out another deafening roar and gave chase, its powerful limbs propelling it up the rocky terrain with terrifying speed. Jack reached the top just as the creature lunged again, its claws narrowly missing him. He turned and swung his spear in a wide arc, striking the creature across its face. It howled in pain, stumbling backward, but quickly regained its footing. "We need to keep moving," Jack said, grabbing Lyra's arm and urging her forward. The group continued their ascent, the creature's roars echoing behind them. Jack's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't outrun it forever, and fighting it head-on seemed impossible. As they rounded a bend, Jack spotted a narrow crevice in the mountainside, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "There," he shouted, pointing toward it. One by one, the girls slipped through the crevice, their small frames making it easier for them to fit. Jack followed, his shoulders scraping against the rough rock walls as he squeezed through. He turned just in time to see the creature clawing at the entrance, its massive frame too large to fit through the narrow gap. The group huddled together, their breaths ragged and their eyes filled with fear. The creature snarled and clawed at the rock, but it couldn't reach them. After what felt like an eternity, it let out a frustrated roar and retreated, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Jack leaned against the rock wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra nodded, though her hands were trembling. We're safe for now." Jack looked around the small, dark space. It wasn't much, but it provided a momentary reprieve from the danger outside. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, "but we can't stay too long. That thing might come back." The girls nodded, their faces pale but determined. Jack knew the journey was far from over, but for now, they had survived another day. The crevice they hid in was small, but it offered enough protection for the moment. The faint sound of the creature's growls echoed in the distance, but it seemed to have lost interest, at least for now. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to Lyra and the others. They were all visibly shaken but relieved to have escaped. "We need to keep moving," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "That thing won't give up, and we need to get to higher ground." Lyra nodded. Her eyes were wide, but there was a determined edge to her expression. "The mountain will be safe. I know it." Jack could see the trust in her eyes, and it gave him the strength to keep going. "All right, let's move." The group scrambled out of the crevice and continued their climb. The mountain's rocky surface was rough and unforgiving, but the higher they went, the more Jack felt a sense of purpose. The air was thinner, the landscape more barren, but something about it felt right. It wasn't just the danger below them, it was the mountain itself. There was a strange pull, an energy in the air that made the hair on the back of Jack's neck stand up. They pressed on, their steps echoing against the stone as they scaled the jagged rocks. The silence of the mountain felt oppressive, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional wind that howled through the gaps in the rocks. Jack kept his eyes trained on the path ahead, but he could sense that something was off. The air seemed to hum with a strange vibration, and the ground beneath them had an unnatural stillness. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jack asked, glancing at Lyra. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, the mountain is sacred to my people. We've never been close, but I can feel it. We're getting close." The higher they climbed, the stranger the surroundings became. The rocks seemed to form unnatural patterns, almost like carvings or symbols. Jack had no idea what they meant, but there was no mistaking the feeling that they were not alone. The mountain had a history, and the deeper they went, the more Jack felt like they were stepping into something much larger than themselves. As they reached a small plateau, Jack stopped. The view was breathtaking. Below them, the forest stretched out like an endless sea of green. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over everything. For a brief moment, they stood there in silence, taking in the beauty of the landscape. "We should rest here for the night," Jack said, his voice breaking the quiet. "We've made good progress, and we need to prepare for whatever comes next." Lyra and the others nodded, sitting down on the rocky ground. Jack took a moment to gather his thoughts. There was something unsettling about the mountain, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The strange hum in the air only made him more uneasy. He glanced at Lyra, but she seemed calm, almost at peace. "Is it always like this here?" Jack asked quietly. Lyra looked up at the sky. It's been a long time since anyone has come this far. The mountain is full of old power. My people used to come here to learn and to connect with the land. But many years ago, we stopped. There were too many dangers." Jack furrowed his brow. "Dangers?" Lyra nodded slowly. "There are forces here, things from before our time, things that don't like outsiders." Jack wasn't sure if she meant creatures or something else, but the tone in her voice made him uneasy. The mountain was hiding secrets, and he had a feeling they were about to uncover them. The night grew colder as the stars twinkled above them. Jack kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkness for any movement. The forest below was silent, but the mountain had its own eerie sounds. Strange whispers seemed to float on the wind, though Jack couldn't make out the words. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that they saw something, an unusual glow coming from the direction they were headed. It wasn't the sunrise, and it wasn't the light of any fire. It was something different, something unnatural. "Do you see that?" Jack asked, pointing to the glow. Lyra's eyes widened. "It's coming from the temple." "The temple?" Jack repeated, puzzled. Lyra nodded. "It's not far from here. My people built it long ago, as a place of learning. but no one has entered it in many years. Jack's heart began to race. They had to find out what was in the temple. It could hold the answers they needed to escape this planet, and possibly even a way to signal for help. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice filled with urgency. The group stood and began to make their way toward the glow. As they got closer, the strange energy in the air seemed to intensify. The ground beneath their feet hummed with a low vibration, and the air felt charged with power. They reached the temple, a massive structure carved into the side of the mountain. The stone was covered in intricate symbols and designs, many of which Jack didn't recognize. But what caught his attention most was the entrance. It was a large archway, bathed in the eerie glow that seemed to pulse from within. "What is this place?" Jack whispered, almost to himself. Lyra's voice was low and reverent. "It's the heart of the mountain, the source of its power." They stepped inside, the temperature dropping as they crossed the threshold. The air was thick with an ancient presence, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were trespassing on something sacred. But there was no turning back now. The temple stood before them, its dark stone walls covered with symbols and carvings. The eerie glow from within pulsed gently, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Jack led the way inside, his senses alert to every sound, every movement. The air was thick, almost electric, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "This place feels different," Jack murmured, his voice low and cautious. He could feel the power in the air, as if the very stones of the mountain were alive, watching them. Lyra walked beside him, her eyes wide with both fear and wonder. "This is where my people used to come. It's sacred ground." As they stepped deeper into the temple, the air grew cooler and the glow became brighter. It wasn't just a light. It was a force, something ancient and powerful that seemed to hum with life. The walls were covered in strange symbols, patterns that Jack couldn't understand, but they seemed to move as they watched. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the mountain itself was pressing down on them. "There must be something here," Jack said, his voice tight. "Something that can help us." They moved further into the heart of the temple, each room seemingly more mysterious than the last. The stone floors were smooth and polished, worn down by time and footsteps from those who had come before. But the deeper they went, the more they began to notice the strange carvings on the walls. They depicted figures, some humanoid, others alien, all intertwined in a dance of energy. Finally, they reached a large chamber at the center of the temple. The walls here were covered in intricate designs that glowed softly, and in the middle of the room stood a pedestal. On top of it was an object, round and glowing, pulsating with the same light that had filled the temple. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was what they had been searching for. "That's it," Lyra whispered, her voice full of awe. Jack's gaze was locked on the object. It seemed to call to him, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Slowly, carefully, he stepped forward, reaching out to touch the glowing artifact. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him. He gasped, stumbling back slightly as the light around them intensified. The temple seemed to come alive, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The carvings on the walls shifted, the symbols moving like living things. Jack's heart raced as he looked around, unsure of what was happening. It was as if the temple itself had awakened, reacting to the presence of the artifact. "Jack," Lyra called, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" "I don't know," Jack said, trying to steady himself. "But it's reacting to us." The light continued to grow brighter, filling the chamber with an almost blinding intensity. Jack felt the pull of the artifact, as if it were connecting to something deep inside him, something primal. He reached out again, this time more deliberately, and as his fingers touched the surface, the light exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding flash. When the light faded, the temple was still. The hum of energy had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Jack blinked, trying to process what had just happened. He was still standing, but something felt different. Something had changed. Lyra slowly approached him, her eyes wide with disbelief. What just happened? Jack looked down at his hands. They didn't feel any different, but there was a strange warmth coursing through his body. It was as if the artifact had transferred something to him, something powerful. He could feel it, like a faint pulse deep within him. I think the artifact chose me, Jack said, his voice shaking. He wasn't sure how, but he knew. He could feel the connection, the bond that had been formed. The power of the mountain of the artifact was now a part of him. Lyra's eyes widened in shock. You're connected to it now. To the power of the mountain. Jack nodded, trying to process the weight of her words. But what does that mean? What does this power do? Before Lyra could answer, there was a low rumble from deep within the mountain. The ground beneath them trembled, and the temple's walls seemed to vibrate with the force of the energy building up inside. Something was happening. Something big. We need to leave, Jack said, urgency rising in his voice. Now. He grabbed Lyra's arm, and together they turned to leave the others out of the temple. The walls seemed to close in around them as the energy intensified. The temple was no longer a place of refuge. It was now a place of danger. As they made their way back toward the entrance, the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. The mountain was alive with power, and whatever had been disturbed by the artifact's awakening was now stirring. They reached the entrance just as the ground beneath them split open. The mountain groaned, and with a deafening roar, something massive surged up from deep below, breaking through the stone. Jack barely had time to react before a large shadow blocked the light, casting the group into darkness. A massive creature, covered in dark scales and glowing eyes, emerged from the depths. It was unlike anything Jack had seen. Huge, with limbs like towers of muscle and a mouth full of jagged teeth. "This is it," Jack muttered, stepping in front of the group. "We have to fight." But as the creature loomed closer, Jack felt the power of the artifact surge within him. The energy that had connected him to the mountain now filled him with strength, making him feel more alive than ever before. With a steady breath, Jack raised his hand. The power within him responded, and a pulse of energy shot out toward the creature, knocking it back. The force was enough to stop it in its tracks, but Jack knew the fight was far from over. Lyra's voice was steady beside him. "We can do this. Together." And with that, Jack knew they had a chance. With the power of the mountain now on their side, they could face whatever came next, together.